Hi, everybody. Welcome to what I hope will be the most dynamic and stimulating session of the day. I know that Gaza and the Israel crisis looks like the most important crisis in the world, but actually close right up there neck and neck is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of a new digital global publication called SEMAFOR, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. We're going to take about an hour with an excellent panel and all of you and discuss what the implications are for the global chessboard, if you will, of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis, and really the ongoing surround sound effects of the geopolitical context this crisis is in, particularly as it affects the Middle East. I want to thank Ebtisam El-Atkebi and the Emirates Policy Center for, as usual, bringing us together. And so if you're standing up and sitting and talking, I'm going to tell you to sit down now because I have no fear calling you out. But let me introduce you to our panel. To my far left is Clifford Kupchan. He's chairman of the Eurasia group. He is a regular attendee of this forum. He is almost never optimistic, and we'll find out how he is today. We then have Nelson Wong, who's president of the Shanghai Center for RIMPAC Strategic and International Studies. Nelson, it's great to have you here. Another regular, Sergey Karaganov. He and I have arm wrestled here on stage now and then, and Sergey is the academic supervisor at the Higher School of Economics of the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. He's also someone we know Vladimir Putin reads. So that's really the only title you need in some ways. And then we have Thomas Greminger, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, who is the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And of course, he was also the former Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and it's great to have you with us, Ambassador. Let me just start out and say that one of the things I find interesting, this program was written and drafted a while back, before October 7th, before the Hamas attack in Israel and all of the relating issues. So if you look at the newspapers, if you're just very simple-minded and say, what is grabbing the world's attention, right now Israel-Hamas is dominating, at least in the United States. But before that, on October 6th, still every day Russia-Ukraine was what we call above the fold in that. But lately, that seems to have been there, that there seems to be a global attention deficit, if you will, at this moment. And I wanted to set that up because that doesn't mean, because the world is distracted by another crisis, that the Ukraine-Russia crisis isn't as geopolitically significant as it was before. And it also means that there is another element of discussion that I hadn't thought about, which is if you have a crisis in the Middle East, if you have a crisis in Europe, and you were to have potentially a crisis in Asia, Nelson, it raises interesting questions about world and global attention, which we'll get into. But let me just start out and first ask Cliff Kupchan to sort of set the stage for us and to help us understand what you see as the implications, mostly for the United States, but I'd love to hear what you think about other big global stakeholders of the Ukraine crisis right now. What have we learned? What have we not learned? And what are you worried about?
Well, the implications of this war, right, for global stakeholders. For the United States, it means persistence. For China, it means, I think, mostly staying out of the way. I don't think the Chinese have a formula that really allows them, or the willingness, the presence on the global stage, to take part in a meaningful way right now. I do think that there was some discussion this morning of what this does, what the Middle East war does to the Ukraine war. I don't think in Washington anyway there's a lot of tension because the military demands of Israel are far less than Ukraine. They need different stuff. I mean, Ukraine really needs air defense. The shopping list is just different. So I don't think there's a big discrepancy. The point I really want to make, though, is a different one, which is that I think this war has clarified and really exposed a big new dynamics, even the international system, which I think is important to get out there at the very beginning. And let me say, I'm still a believer in bipolarity. I've made that argument here before, and I still believe it, but that's not the point I want to make today. The point I want to make today is that we're working in a very kind of weak kind of geopolitical system, which I think facilitates, gives rise to some of these conflicts. The
What do you mean by a weak geopolitical system?
I think we're in a period of geopolitical recession, in a period where neither superpower has the interest or ability. Superpowers, I think, are U.S. and China. But nobody is really interested in collective goods rights now, which makes a fertile soil for these wars to grow in, and I think that's very dangerous. I think that we are also in a period, and people have lost the context for the world we live in. We've gone from a period of, I think, unipolarity or Cold War, bipolarity in the Cold War, to unipolarity, and both of those are actually quite good at preventing conflicts. You had rigid alignments during the Cold War. You had a period of unipolarity where there wasn't that much space to maneuver because the U.S. was the global cop. And what do you got now? You got two kind of retrenching superpowers, and that, I think, leaves a lot of space for these conflicts we're seeing. I think it leaves space for Putin to make this really bad judgment that he made and go for the land grab, the reorganization of European security in Ukraine. I think it makes it easier, for Hamas to do what they did because the U.S. is so preoccupied. The response is likely to be tied up in knots, I think indeed like it has been in some ways. It makes it much easier for the Azerbaijanis to do what they did to the Armenians. So in a way, it's free hunting season. The one final point I want to make here, though, is I think there's a fascinating dilemma going on among, there's some green shoots blowing. I'm never optimistic, you're wrong. So what I find fascinating today is what I've called, the rising global power, the rising middle states of the global south. And I'll conclude with this. But I think that there's, and I focus here on Iran, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. The 5 members of the global south, the developing world, which belong to the G20, and in my view, are playing the US and China off against each other. This fascinating dynamic that really is a green shoot. And as far as the relationship to the war is, what have they done here? They have gone with neutrality. They've stuck with it. A year ago, that was very controversial. Now it's accepted that these states are going to be neutral. And the final point I'll make is that these countries have, in fact, in my view anyway, refused to cooperate with US sanctions, continued to cooperate with Russia during the war. And what do we see? What do we see from the Russian Federation? Growth rates during the war. The IMF for this year, 0.7% growth. For next year, 1.2% growth. That is nothing less than astounding. And I think that this sort of refusal of a lot of the world to go along with American financial power is I wouldn't call it, as a political scientist, I call it fascinating. As an American, I call it problematic. But I think it's a really interesting new twist on the international system, which is important to recognize right up front.
Thank you. I will acknowledge this is the first time I've heard you be optimistic. So there we go. So
too much coffee this morning.
Big applause for that. Let me ask you, Thomas, to kind of take this a step further. I want to kind of look around the world in sort of the transatlantic dimensions of this. I interviewed this guy named Andrei Kortunov, who happens to be in the audience a while back, and he really looked at the Russia-Ukraine conflict and other issues as a kind of shock effect, if you will, of the ongoing end of the Cold War, and said it's not over, it's not fun. And if you look at some of these conflicts a different way, and I think, if you look at them slightly differently than Cliff, you could argue that maybe this is the sense of contraction of American power, that it is American power being tested or whatnot. We can kind of wrestle over that. But whether or not this is the United States in contraction that's leaving in some voids of why we're seeing some of these conflicts. But I'd love to get your sense on the transatlantic side of the relationship and also Europe specifically about the impact of the ongoing crisis. And I want to jump to Russia and China.
Well, I would say what is obvious is that this Russian aggression against Ukraine has unified, has strengthened transatlantic bonds, has brought a sense of purpose back to NATO. In that sense, in a way, you have now a very strong European security order. Only it's one that very much relies on confrontation and on deterrence. And I just believe that this is not what we want for the medium to long term. So any elements of cooperative security have gone. and it's very difficult to foresee when such elements would come back. At the same time, if you want to manage risks, again, in a medium to long term, in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian area, I think we should wish and should want to have some cooperative security back. If not, it's just going to be, terribly expensive in terms of
Are you talking about cooperation with Russia?
No, well, generally, of course, a cornerstone of cooperative security has always been a cooperation between, initially the Soviet Union and the West, and later on between Russia and the West, and I think that needs to come back. This said, this has not all changed by the 21st of February. In that sense, it was a long process of degrading relations between Russia and the West, an unraveling of this complex system of arms control that we had built up over a long time, and that had provided us with quite some stability for quite some time.
Who is the most to blame for the unraveling of that relationship?
I think, I think both sides. I think we've been driven by the security dilemma for more than 2 decades and haven't managed to get out of this security dilemma. Of course, both sides have very explicit, elaborate narratives why it is the other side, that is to be blamed. But if you look a bit closer, I think it's a long history of missed opportunities, of misunderstandings. When I was Secretary General, there were last attempts by, for instance, a structured dialogue to bring back some sort of confidence and security building measures, military risk reduction and arms control. But frankly, both United States and NATO weren't particularly interested. Russia was busy modernizing its army, wasn't very interested. So you had a large majority of participating states of the OEC wanting, again, arms control back, but basically major powers not particularly interested. And I think that was significant, for this relation going down and down and down, which, still, at the end of the day, does not justify military aggression. But it illustrates this history of lost opportunities to mitigate, to combat, the lines of conflict between Russia and the West and between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you. Sergey, would love to know if you see any positive outcome that would bring Europe, the West, and Russia back together with some deal on Ukraine, or whether, as you've written recently, essentially what needs to happen, you kind of argue for the health of the world system and deterrence, we need to go all the way. You've advocated even using nuclear weapons to remind the world about nuclear weapons and deterrence. I'm just wondering, particularly on the nuclear weapons front, maybe you can share with us how many people in the Kremlin agree with you, would be good to know. But really kind of give us the architecture you think of where the Russia-Ukraine conflict is going.
Thanks. First of all, of course, I will share thinking of Kremlin, even if I knew, but I don't know, of course. For a second, but first also, of course, I must congratulate Princess Abdizam. I mean, that's a great success. Congratulate and thank you. It is not a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It is a conflict between Russia and the West, and the conflict about the composition of the future world. Ukrainians are used as a cannon fodder. For Russia, it is essential, and we shall win this war, whatever the cost. Hopefully, without losing tens more thousands of men. Eventually, if needed, we will escalate. Hopefully, not to the end. But there is no question that we will win. The question for the West is whether they retreat with flying banners, or there will be another catastrophe for them, or even the worse than a catastrophe.
So do you see a definitive win, or do you see an ongoing slump?
Definite, and eventually there could be, of course, piecemeal solutions on the way, but it would be a definitive win. But it is a win for all. And I will come to that later. Second, this war is about managing the retreat of the West to the right place in the new world order. West has been occupying for 500 years a place because of its military preponderance mostly, whereas by imposing its cultural, economic, and political interests, but it was based on force, military force. It was able to siphon off the world GNP. Soviet Union first undermined that capacity. Now we retreated it for 15 years. Now we're back. And now, of course, the West is in full retreat and is in desperate counterattack. And we are freeing the world, and we will continue to free the world from the Western yoke. And in the end, we will have a brilliant world where the West will be one of the centers. There will be several Wests, of course, because it will disintegrate. There's no question about that. There will be 2 Europes or 3 Europes. The United States will stay. I mean, it's robust with all its problems. And then we will have a new balance. But there is another layer. We have entered about 50 years ago a period of the world earthquake. It will continue for 25 years more. And the danger of all-out war is here and is growing. So this conflict is also about how to manage.
What would precipitate that?
There will be dozens of crises because the tectonic shifts, the tectonic plates have shifted. There will be dozens of crises, and they could end up in an all-out war, including a nuclear war. So it's on the highest level. This conflict in Europe is about preventing the World War III. So that is why I think it should be seen as a Russian-Ukrainian war, which is a joke. I mean, of course, Ukrainians are using cannon fodder and Russians are dying, but it is for the future of the world.
Well, let me ask you, Sergey, in the article you wrote about the Ukraine conflict, and you talk about nuclear weapons. It's a very, very interesting journey you take. But you talk about the fact that maybe we need to lower the bar on the use of nuclear weapons. You advocate lowering the bar. And you say, and the outcome of this is very rosy. And then Russia and humanity will persevere through all the hardships and go into the future, which seems to me bright, multipolar, multicultural, multicolored, and giving countries and peoples a chance to build their own and common future. It's a very unusual jump from the use of nuclear weapons and what you think will be unleashed. I'd just like to understand that connection.
It's very easy. I mean, as I've said, we have started a period of crises. I mean, it will continue, and the period of the crisis will multiply. There is no question about that. I mean, because I could, of course, explain why, but it is very obvious. So the question is now whether we could reinsert some kind of sense and nuclear fuse back into the system. Because for 70 years, it was only the nuclear fuse which helped the world from going into a third nuclear war. Now this nuclear fuse, the fear of war, have weakened. So we have to reintroduce that into our minds, into the minds of our leaders, into the minds of the leaders of the world. Otherwise, I do not see any other way to avoid a global catastrophe, or many global catastrophes. And eventually, of course, a period of wars can end up in a collapse of the humanity, even without major use of nuclear weapons, if we continue like that. But there is absolutely sure that there will be dozens of conflicts. And the major powers could come to some kind of an understanding that first they should not fight each other. by the way, because what is happening now was unthinkable for any strategic thinker even 5 years ago, that a group of countries will be fighting a war in the underbelly of a nuclear power. That was absolutely unthinkable. We have to reintroduce the fear of a big war. And then, hopefully, we will then start to build new foundations of the peace order. I could assure that it will not be built on the basis of something pan-European. Europe will be going down anyway, but we will, of course, they are our cousins, so we'll try to keep them quiet. But it will be, of course, it should be then pan-continental, pan-Eurasian. Anyway, involving China and other major Eurasian powers.
Thank you. Nelson, just want to jump to you.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go a lot of different directions. You'd love to hear what you think about lowering the bar on use of nuclear weapons, but also to go to what Cliff Kupchan laid out, which is, Cliff basically says he sees the world as a bipolar world with China and the U.S. as the big powers, but they're weaker than normal system. You see the rise of this new cluster of countries. And I'm just, I've been sitting here watching China for a while, wondering if life is good to see its two classic geostrategic rivals, Russia and America, kind of tied up, and whether life is good for China.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Aptasant for the invitation and a big congratulations for the achievement. Answering to your questions about China-US rivalry, the two big powers, I think before we address all this global power struggle, I think we have to first of all understand there is a big difference in different cultures, because China is not the Soviet Union. The competition between China and the US is quite different from the competition between the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War days. China is a latecomer onto the world stage, and we have to accept that. So whenever people start...
Or an early comer if you have a long
well,
history.
in modern history, let's call it this way, yeah. So whenever people start questioning or accusing China for not taking a side or slow in responding to any crisis in the world, I said you have to understand where we come from. For people who understand the Chinese culture, I said, if you go to China and if you stay there long enough, you're bound to come across situations whereby you see people fighting in the street and quarreling in the street, and you don't see people coming over to say, you're wrong, you're right. No. The only thing you hear is people going there, don't fight, don't fight. Always calling people to stop fighting first. So this is also why whenever there is a conflict in the world, China is always the party, no matter how late, is always the party to call for peace. Cease fire first. It comes actually from our culture. We're not the kind of people that is hasty to make a judgment on things, because we consider a hasty judgment as a kind of weakness. It might be different in other cultures, but we consider restraint and reserve as a kind of virtue. So this is when I think the rest of the world, when people start dealing with China as an upcoming power or the next superpower, whatever you call it, I think people have to understand and hopefully to appreciate who we are, because we are different.
And where does Taiwan fit into
that? It is an obvious question on almost every forum. China continues to want the whole world to understand that this is a domestic affair. China does feel upset when it gets cooked up and become an international thing, something to be discussed at international forums, because China will feel insulted that this is a domestic issue, and why should other people start poking your fingers into our domestic affairs?
But it does recognize that there's been that strategic ambiguity around Taiwan was one of the biggest investments that both Chinese leaders and American leaders created so they could move their relationship forward. So there's no ignorance of the fact that this is not seen by other major players the same way.
Well, the strategic ambiguity is a policy adopted by the US in handling its relations with China. And China kind of agreed to that in the first place. But as time goes by, let's put it this way. When I grow up, I'm over 60 now, when I grow up, the only thing I heard and I remembered about Taiwan is that we have to liberate Taiwan. This has always been in our mind. So, if you discuss about the Taiwan issue across China, in mainland China, you will find no one questioning about why should China take over Taiwan, or in our words, why the island of Taiwan should be returned to the motherland. So this is the rhetoric, this is our belief that has been carrying on for the last 70 years. So when this topic of Taiwan is trying to get independent, and then with the US selling weapons, sending weapons to Taiwan, people on the mainland across China feel puzzled. They feel really puzzled. And so when the government says it is a domestic affair, everybody supports it. So this is something I think the rest of the world, and particularly those that still think that Taiwan should be separate, a separate entity, I think people will need to think twice, because this is, to China, this is the core interest. And I think with all the visits of Chinese officials and top diplomats to the US recently, this has been always on top of the agenda. And I believe the cards has been laid bare in front of the American counterparts.
Let me ask all of you, what's interesting listening to everyone very carefully, as I've just tried to do, is you really get a sense that this world is very different than 20, 30 years ago. It's much more in flux. There are rising, second-tier powers Cliff just talked about. China may be moving in ways that may be different patterns in terms of what it's trying to achieve. Sergey sees a world of lots of skirmishes, lots of conflicts coming up to destabilize that world. Thomas, you kind of defined something that's really interesting. You sort of, in a way, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you, in a way, said that in a way, NATO and Europe have become revitalized because they've got a good enemy again. That enemy, we talked about this at the Abu Dhabi strategic dialogues before, debates before, where how interesting it was that until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO was flopping around. You had Macron saying NATO was brain dead. You had many people asking, what is NATO's purpose in the world? So the resurrection of an enemy or a rival has given revised purpose. It raises interesting questions. If you are dependent on that to hold yourself together, how stable is that? So what I'm hearing is a lot of fragility in the global system. Cliff is saying, no, that's no. I'm going to give Cliff the first opportunity to come in and talk about it. But there's another dimension here, which is the domestic politics. Xi Jinping's, got elected last year, so he's fine. Putin up in March. I don't know if he's in any real threat. I mean, there was Prigozhin. There was an effort to challenge Putin from within. I have no idea whether there's enough resonance domestically. But a lot of Europe is going to be elected in 2024. And in the United States, we have a presidential election coming up next year. And I just think it's really important to note that a bigger portion of Americans than I've ever seen do not care about the international system, do not think being involved in the world benefits them. They believe they fought the Cold War with Russia and China won. And you have another ambivalence about global affairs. So, Chris, I want you to kind of help us understand, when you look at these various pieces, how much do you think domestic politics is going to get in the way of even the best intentions on the chessboard?
Well, first, let me say I think Putin's going to win. Look, I mean,
I had to put it out there.
I think that's kind of high probability. The United States' biggest election, maybe in the history of the country. We have, it's a dysfunction on display in many ways. There's two guys almost.
But if the election were held tomorrow, Donald Trump would win.
I think it'd be 60-40 chance Donald Trump would win. And people don't get that. The guy's probably going to win. There's a good chance he's going to win. Just because you're facing 91 felony counts doesn't mean you can't be president of the United States. And indeed, he's extremely strong. It's hard to understand. I go home to Wisconsin. I talk to people a little up from Madison, where I live. They're good church-going people, and 90% of them are going to vote for Trump because they're scared and they're ill-informed. But it is what it is. So I think domestic politics, at least in the States, is going to play. And that, I know in this region of the world, Mr. Trump, I think, has a pretty good reputation. I understand why. He and his son-in-law were quite, I think, forthcoming to the world and to this part of the world. And also the issue of human rights, and there was respect for domestic politics, and I get that. But there are broader issues about what U.S. would look like domestically. I think some of the blue cities and states would start to develop autonomy movements. I think there'd be a lot of violence. I think the states that you know now wouldn't look like the states that we'd see in the future. But I just want to make a few comments about what I've heard. Nelson, I have to say that to my mind, China has one of the most largest definitions of domestic politics in the world that extends from the South China Sea to Taiwan to Hong Kong. And so I just want to be clear on that. Sergey, you've been a friend for 40 years. Do you really believe all this stuff with nuclear weapons? It strikes me as just a little bit otherworldly. So if I get you right, and I've read your stuff, and as usual, you're a conceptual genius, and so that's part of the problem is you're so elegant in writing. But you are advocating a nuclear use against a European country. Any Russian nuclear use, I'm very confident, because I've talked to the people who do this stuff in the United States, would be met with an overwhelming U.S. conventional response against Russian targets that were involved in that strike. Look, this is what I hear. I'm very confident about what I'm saying. That's all I'm going to say. That means dead Russians, killed by Americans. Then we're off to the races, because the Russians are going to have to kill some Americans. And we can all do the math. We have a global nuclear war. So I just want to be very clear that I think that I kind of know what you're doing. You want to restore deterrence. I get it. But I think the way you're doing it, in my own view, is extremely dangerous.
Sergey, since he attacked you so specifically.
First of all, what I'm doing, and I'm quite proud of what I'm doing, is that I'm trying to prevent a nuclear war or deterioration of the world towards an all-out war. But to do that, you have to make deterrence workable. But to make it workable, the other side should believe that you would use them, and we would use them if necessary. However, there are impediments, and the last impediment is fear of American reprisal. Come on, it is impossible. I know that many of your senior officials have passed these views to our officials. These are laughable. How come, in order to attack Russia even with conventional, and the answer would be nuclear, again against Europe or against American bases in Europe, you have to have America hater in White House, America haters in Pentagon, who would allow your president or your military to attack Russia. Never Russia per se would be attacked, because, as I've said, there would be the second wave. Hopefully, we would never come to that. But the only real impediment for Russia using nuclear weapons if it is pushed to the wall, and if we decide that we should stop losing our best man, is the moral restrictions. And these are serious.
I mean,
because
you also say in your article, Sergey,
yes,
I mean, I was reading last night to try and fall asleep, and then I read your article and I couldn't fall asleep afterward. But you're also saying that the world system and the memory of what happened in Japan and the dropping of the bombs, etc., has dissipated, and that you said it would be an interesting, good global public service to remind the world of the...
Hopefully without using them.
Right.
But we have to remind that. But there is no question that Americans will fight back. But there is a tiny chance. But for that, you have to have an insane man in White House and America haters in Pentagon. Because sending any kind of serious weapons against Russia would invite reprisal to the territory of the United States. That's out of question.
Thomas wants to jump in, but real quick, Nilsson, really fast. If Xi Jinping were sitting in our audience today, how would he feel about the,
Well, tell everybody to calm down.
Thomas?
Yeah, and he would be right. I would say very much. I think we all want to prevent the third World War, and we want to kind of underscore this notion that a nuclear war cannot be won and thereby shouldn't be fought. But it's definitely not by fueling this idea that a tactical nuclear war can be controlled. And I think that is what I find extremely dangerous about Sergey's proposal. I see his notion of a wake-up call, but it's just a way too costly wake-up call. And again, this illusion that we had in the 80s, that you can control escalation of a tactical nuclear war. Fortunately, to what I saw, there was huge pushback even in his own country to this proposal. And my sense in regularly talking to Russian experts, also they think that, that shouldn't be tested.
So let me ask you, in this next section, a little about something, and then I want to go to the audience. But I want to go to what Cliff was just talking about with the rise of these second-tier powers and their importance, and how they're playing off the superpowers, China off the US, off of each other. And so you think about classic terms of polarity or bipolarity, it doesn't get you very far because there's a very different dynamic going on. We also see the so-called global south aligning in ways that I think are very surprising for the United States, particularly in the Gaza-Israel crisis, but also in Ukraine, also on climate, also on a lot of other transnational issues. There's a greater divide. And I'd like to start out with Thomas and Cliff for a second, but just to ask you, are you surprised that when it comes to choices and playing off, that the global south, so to speak, and developing nations are so actively not aligning with the West? Because I am surprised that Russia and China are doing as robustly well with some of the global south as they are. So, Thomas?
Well, let us recall that the initial response of the UN General Assembly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was quite clear. So there was an overwhelming support of international law and condemning breaches of international law of this scale. I think that was fairly. I think that was a very clear call, and
but lots of countries, even the one we're sitting in right now, didn't line up behind that.
It's true that there is many countries they refuse on the one hand to side with one of the two poles. There are not many that really side with Russia either. So it's kind of an attempt of remaining in a way non-aligned.
Right.
And I think it's also a pointing out to all these double standards, that the West, and the West should be more self-critical, is responsible for. So, there is immediately a narrative. Well, before the 7th of October, there was often, the Global South pointing to inconsistencies of Western policies towards the Near East, towards the Palestinian cause. Well, this is now, of course, 10 times stronger. So this underscoring of double standards, I think, is important. And yeah, of maintaining, I would say, giving preference of national interests over joining a camp. I think that is the pattern that I see.
Sergey is jumping out of his chair.
Yes, let's put this. First of all, we in Russia prefer to call it a global majority and not global south. For one simple reason. China is also partly a northern country, but Russia is a northern country, and we are now the military linchpin of the global majority. We are, because we did away with the military preponderance of the West, we freed the global majority from 500 years yoke through which it has been exploiting these people here. And now that is why.
But Sergey, they
are positively neutral.
Yeah.
They know
Sergey, what I would say with all respect,
that we are fighting for them.
Yeah, but one of the interesting dimensions of the moment, I think, and I think Cliff got at this, is that the global rest,
yes,
I'll call them, are not always lining up with Russia either. In fact, you see these nations as kind of free agents, much more transactional. Some days we're with you, some days they're not, but they're not always in your camp either.
No, not in my camp, and we are not inviting them. I mean, but they are positively neutral, and that's what we need. They are friends, they are partners. We don't need, support, and we don't need them to follow our way. All the more that we are also devising our way in the future world. No, we are not. We are for multiplicity of political cultures, for multiplicity of cultural cultures, for multiplicity of languages, races. I mean, we are one of the most international societies in the world,
right,
and we are proud of that.
Right.
Proud of that.
Thank you. Nelson, I want you to jump in here as well, but I want you also to help, because we often talk about China and Russia as if they are allied, and of course, they have said that they have a relationship now without boundary. I asked the current Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Ye Feng, at the Aspen Security Forum, what redeeming qualities he saw in Vladimir Putin. And he laughed, and he said it was George Bush that looked into the eyes of Vladimir Putin, and saw a soul, etc. And he says, how did that go? Yeah. And in that exchange, you saw a kind of levity, a sort of humor, that maybe not everything is always well between China and Russia, and you had to be careful. So it was a really interesting, important moment. So as we say that, I also want us to be careful of blind spots in our assumptions, but would love to get your sense as you look at the global south. And China, I think right now has made very important statements on the Israel-Gaza crisis. It has made statements on Ukraine, I believe, that essentially are not positive regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine and this. But we'd love to get your take.
Well, I think it's China's position, even though it usually came a bit later than expected, the final statement that China made on all the global issues do reflect what we think as a nation, and it reflects the thinking of the majority of the people. So with regard to China's relation with Russia, I think even though the public opinions in China towards what's happening in Ukraine is divided, that's the public opinion. However, the general consensus is still that Russia and China have become natural partners, mostly on the economic front, and also because our two economies are quite complementary, actually. When you start
They have
looking
oil
at it.
and you need it, right?
Well, exactly. Russia has exactly what China needs, and China also has what Russia needs as well. So this is quite obvious. But in the meantime, when people start asking me the question, is China a friend of Russia? And I said, yes, depending on what you're talking about. But then I said, we just touched upon the term global majority or global south or the global rest. I said, let's draw people's attention to the fact that most of these countries, they have different backgrounds, different religions, different political systems. Why are they coming together? Not as a united front, but it shows that people are not happy with the way the world has been governed, with the way that the majority or most of the developing countries have been treated, in a sense. So that's why I think organizations like the BRICS is becoming more popular. Because we're all different in terms of religion, culture, and political systems. India, Brazil, China, Russia, we're all different.
Right.
South Africa, we're all different. So why are these countries coming together? This is something, I think this is a question I would hope that the US and its allies would need to perhaps give it some thought.
Well, let me give Cliff, before we go to the audience, the last word on this. But Cliff, as you answer and talk about the rise of these second-tier powers, you've also written about Ukraine-Russia conflict triggering deglobalization as a function of the weaponization of food and energy, and how it has made the global kind of neoliberal economic trends we used to see become far more regionally and locally focused. And I'm just interested in that dimension as we see the rise of these other powers and what that looks like as we think about a future world order. Is it a interconnected high fear world? I mean, globalization used to be the growth of high trust networks. I think we're connected, but now we have high fear networks. Is that what we're talking about?
The phenomenon that I wrote about a couple of years ago was that one of the impacts of the war in Ukraine was to drive up energy prices. We all know about that, but especially food prices, which impacted in a very negative way a lot of the countries in this region, from Pakistan to Tunisia, Egypt, a massive food importer, and encouraged a lot of these countries to put tariff barriers around their food imports. Like many barriers, they're meant to be temporary, but there's really very few temporary protectionist barriers in the world these days. They became permanent, and that started to deglobalize food markets. But what I see more broadly is a fragmenting of the global system, and I'm hardly the only one. The IMF has written about this, really quite well. The system is fragmenting. We're seeing a process of regionalization, and I think this plays in directly with the sort of rising middle powers, of the global south, or developing world, as you want to call it, because all of these countries, the ones that I focus on anyway, which I think are a good barometer for the grouping as a whole, are key regional powers in their region. So what you see is a global process that is strengthening these powers. These powers are, maybe unlike China, but they're looking to rise, not in any kind of a, interestingly, not in any kind of a hegemonic way at all, but it's India first, it's Brazil first. This is basic naked self-interest. And I think that's what's really, fascinating about what's going on in the world today. It's this combination of regionalization with ambition.
There's oxygen for them to do it.
There's oxygen because, look, the world has been through a series of massive global crises. From the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine, really before the pandemic was even over. When the world really changes, whether it's the Napoleonic Wars before the concept of Europe or the World War II before the UN, crisis creates real change.
Right.
I think what we saw here, we didn't get it, is this crisis really created space for other countries to rise up from the substructure, kind of. And to me, that's what we're seeing is really exciting.
Sergey had a two-finger. Sergey had a two-finger.
Yes, there is an underlying challenge and crisis which we hate to discuss here. And that is that the modern capitalism, not only modern liberal capitalism, has brought us to a dead end. It is clear that we have to change the way we are living, we are thinking. I mean, it's not we are thinking about growing consumption without limits, and that is about capitalism, is killing us or killing our children. Clearly, we are talking about climate change, blah, 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 but the real thing is that we are consuming our planet. And that is the biggest, the deepest foundation of the crisis we are facing. Hopefully, we will face these issues in the future. I have not seen many conferences where they attack this particular issue, but that is the core of the whole problem.
That would be a really great conference. I'd like to know what Russia thinks its economic system is. It looks pretty capitalist to me.
That is a problem.
Yeah.
I could assure you. I mean, we are trying to rethink that.
Let's go to the audience. We have Mansour Al-Marzouki, if I'm pronouncing it right, here. And what we're going to do, folks, is go lightning round questions and comments, lightning round responses, and try and get through as many of these as we can. We're trying to speed things up. So, Mansour, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to thank the presenters. Very interesting presentations. I heard the differences, the comments about different shopping lists, and I would like to question this. But before I do that, I would like to comment by saying if the rise of China has upended Western and US economic monopolies, the recent events in Gaza have upended the Western moral authority. Now back to the question about the shopping lists. Yes, of course, Ukraine requires a different set of weapons, equipments, etc. However, both categories, to Israel or to Ukraine, are considered military aid that requires money, assembly lines, production plans, etc., etc. Logistical questions. The other element is that both consume diplomatic capital, lobbying states, statements, voting from different nations, etc.
Right.
And both are high level consumers of the weight vis-a-vis international law, international humanitarian law, which has a high cost for the US and the West in general. In that sense, wouldn't you agree, Mr. Kupchan, that it is in a sense depleting Western and US and specific diplomatic capital, resources, etc.? Thank you.
Cliff, all yours.
Well, I get it. I mean, it's a good question. It's a fair question. And the question, sort of, what if Iran goes for a breakout capability now? I mean, really, what is Khomeini thinking? Could it possibly get any better? Of course they want a nuclear weapon. Is it a good time to get it? Well, we've got four other, including China, we've got four other major crises working here. But look, I mean, it's a big government. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think Biden came himself. I used to know Joe Biden when he worked on the Hill. He's all into foreign policy. He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So I think the government can handle it. I really don't see a lot of people overly perturbed. I mean, yes, the populist Republicans in the House, they don't like foreign aid, so they want to kill Ukraine aid. But aside from them, there's broad bipartisan support for a lot of this. So I think it's a challenge. I think it's a stretch. But I think that the resources, the United States government, are up to that challenge.
I just want to respond real quickly, as you raised something really interesting about rebuilding states that are essentially war zones and what all that takes. And it takes a lot of risk insurance. And I worry about whether it's US or Europe, if you go in to kind of rebuild Gaza or you go in to rebuild Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is going to be the biggest construction project in the world. I wonder whether we should launder all this money through China, sometimes, because I think that to some degree the dollar or whoever the sponsor of that construction project is becomes a target depending on it. But it's interesting that China, sort of staying out of so many of these things, is going to be less targeted. And many of my friends at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce would be furious with me. But I think it's an interesting question of how do you rebuild Ukraine? How do you rebuild Gaza, which we're going to have to think about doing, in a way that you don't blow up the school or the shopping center or the municipal facilities or infrastructure, right after you build them? And maybe that's why you need a China or Turkey or other players, in this. But anyway, it's a really interesting question. Hassan Al-Hassan.
Thank you very much. I'm right here.
Where's here?
Right
there
in
you are.
front.
Hey, good.
So my question is directed to Professor Sergey. Russia seems to have made the engagement of the Islamic world a foreign policy priority. It's identified it in its foreign policy concept. And in a recent op-ed, Alexander Dugin, he wrote this in Arabic, I think a few days ago in Al-Majalla, said that essentially Russia and the Islamic world are fighting the same enemy. Agents of Western imperialism in the Middle East, i.e. Israel, and in Russia, and in Eurasia, meaning Ukraine. I hate to break it to my Russian friends, but the Islamic world is not a homogeneous bloc. Muslim countries agree on very little of strategic substance, except perhaps not wanting to be dragged into great power competition. How does Russia intend to operationalize this focus on engaging the Islamic world? And how do you then leverage that strategically to serve Russia's foreign policy interests?
Great question. Thank you. Sergey?
First of all, Russia does not want to operationalize our friendship with the Islamic world. That's it. The question is. The second answer is we are very much an Islamic country. And by the way, we are now deep in the research and thinking about how close our version of Christianity and Islam are close. I mean, actually, they're very close. And we are sharing many of the same values. And it is not against the West. It's against it's for the new world of multiple orders, of freedom of religion, of freedom of thinking, freedom of culture, etc. It is not, a person like you mentioned, who is I assume is an interesting but fringe person in Russian elite, is thinking about fighting the West. No, we're thinking about bringing the world together and in this multicolor order. I must say that because of my involvement during the last 10 years with the Islamic world and 25 years with the Asian world, I feel myself much more comfortable and much more at home now than I used to, because when I was mostly going to European and American conferences, it was getting dull. Now it is interesting.
It's never dull when you're there. Martin Wilhelm. Martin Wilhelm.
No. Western conference. Now it is interesting. Yes.
Martin Wilhelm. Hey, Martin.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my question is also to Sergey.
But I'm going to let Thomas and Nelson answer it too. So.
Yes, this will be a really hard one for them to answer. But imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you still have your views, but you're the national security advisor in the White House, and you don't want to be fired the same day. What would you recommend to your boss?
To the American president?
To the American president, yes.
Oh, the problem is that we do not interfere into internal affairs of other countries. But I normally, when I want to criticize my Chinese friends, I'm saying, if I were a Chinese, I would do that and that. So if I were an American, not American, I would say to my friends in the White House else, the world is different. Let's collect our belongings, keep our friendships, and get out. But, of course, not igniting on the road back. All the possible places, like in Taiwan, like we tried 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, or in Gaza, like it looks like somebody's trying to ignite the whole of Middle East, or like in Ukraine, because in the end, our country, meaning my country, United States, would be in an excellent position as a great power without many vulnerabilities it has created itself when it was omnipotent, but now it is these links and these dependencies are becoming liabilities. So, I mean, very retreat with flying banners, and we will help, no problem.
I want to take Martin's question and address it to Nelson real quickly. Because I think it's interesting because, Nelson, if you were to be advising the U.S. president, it's not for Chinese interests, but if you were thinking of American interests on the global chessboard, what would you be advising the American president?
Well, I would do perhaps a different advice of do not engage in interfering into other people's affairs, actually. Instead, start doing what China is doing, helping people to build new roads and highways and new airports and ports instead of creating troubles here and there.
Some people are actually giving the president that advice. That's interesting. Thomas, you had a two-finger.
Yes, I would try to help him deal with a very important strategic dilemma, and that is, on the one hand, you don't want a long war. I think that cannot be in an American interest. At the same time, you can't reward a military aggressor. So you don't want to push Ukraine to ceasefire negotiations at this point. You'll have to kind of continue to support Ukraine in defending its sovereignty. But at the same time, I think you should get ready for what has been referred to as the Plan B. So what happens when the sides are too exhausted, when they realize that the long war is too costly and they want to return to the negotiation table? What kind of ceasefire? What are components, elements of a ceasefire? What, once we have a ceasefire, would allow us not to get stuck for decades in a frozen conflict, but to move on towards resolving the conflict, both between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and the West. There are two conflicts.
So real quick, Sergey?
Yes, if I were again an American, I would also advise my president, go on with this slow-burning conflict for a couple more years, so you could suck in more European juices, so they will never return, and will be so weak that they would be ever loyal. But there, because Americans are doing extremely good job. Actually, it is not a war against Russia. It is a war against Europe, because they are robbing Europe of their industrial capacities like mad. And I must say, I'm criticizing and, as I was saying, hating American policies, but here I applaud. I mean, great job.
Clifford's face is so scrunched up that I know you have a two-finger.
Yeah, hey, look, a couple things here. First, we talked about scenarios in the questions for this. I think this war is going to go on for the rest of Putin's life, and I think he's in very good shape. So we have to all realize, how serious and sad this is. Hundreds of thousands of kids are going to die. This war will probably go on for 10 more years. I don't see any way to stop it. I haven't heard any ideas up here first. Right. Secondly, one thing we haven't talked about that I got to mention, which is we are living through the death of strategic arms control. New START expires in 2026. It's going to be impossible to write another strategic arms control treaty. So just step back a minute and imagine a world in which there's no arms control. That monitoring and verification, everything we've taken for granted since I was a kid, is going to fall by the wayside. So I just want everybody to be sober for a minute. U.S.-Russian relations don't exist. They won't exist. The war is going to go on for years. This is really bad. So I'll stop with that.
I'm going to take one last question, and I'm sorry to the others that are up there. Mohammed Baharoun, and we're going to make it fast. Mohammed.
Thank you very much. It's
Where are you, Mohammed? I want to see. Oh, there you go.
To all of you.
Thank you.
Quick question. This is multipolarity, so we've got Europe, US, China, and Russia. What about the role of the middle powers?
Right.
The people who provide energy, rare earth minerals, manpower to the world, the people who make the world go around. instead the people who have the weapons to destroy it? What's their role? Thank you.
Cliff, that was a big topic of yours.
Right, that's what I was trying to capture. I mean, I think the energy that we all feel, it's not the BRICS. It is these countries individually. They're rising. Their geopolitical heft is increasingly evident. They're mediating conflicts. Maybe they'll do, we didn't talk about the role of these countries in mediating Gaza. I think it's a real sort of possibility. They actually want to. So I think that fate is one of a rising group of countries. And that's the good news, and I'll leave it there.
Nelson?
Well, I think the chessboard is forever in movement, which is quite natural because the world is developing every day. So the way to prevent chaos or to prevent chaos from developing into crisis is that, first of all, we have to respect each other. And that's the most important thing. We can't just say we respect each other, but actually you have to respect the people. And to be a big brother, I think the US need to respect everyone. It could be difficult because I keep imagining the world as a classroom. If you're a big boy, you tend not to be liked by a lot of people. But in the meantime, you have to look after everyone, right? Otherwise, people are not going to recognize you as a big boy. And I think what we need to do against is greed and fear. It is greed that makes us endlessly expanding our sphere of influence, and it is the fear that can make people irrational. The fear of losing power, the fear of being left behind. Right. So these are the things I think we have to bear in mind and keep reminding ourselves.
Great comment. Sergey?
Yeah, and first I agree with Nelson but on this moral issue, but there is another issue, and that is that the world we are hoping to get into, this multipolar world, will be a world of much more freedom for middle powers. Because there will be no hegemons. If China wants to become a hegemon over the years, I don't know, I'm sure it doesn't want, but who knows? I mean, there will be 5 powers on the continent which will be balancing it.
Well, China including hopes that it will Russia, be a different power.
Yes, yeah. Including Russia. Yeah. But so China could not afford that. So there will be no hegemons. So middle powers will be able to maneuver and to get the best bet.
Right. Ambassador, you get the last word.
Thank you. But we are unhappy about the way the world has been governed. We are moving towards a multipolar world. But I think multipolarity cannot be chaos. It cannot be one country attacking another. I think multipolarity must imply predictability, structure, rules, and cooperation. And I think in getting there to a multipolar order that has these features, I think middle powers can play an important role.
What I'd say, thank you very much, all of you, for a really wonderful discussion. What I'd say to this last question about multiple powers, one of my big criticisms of President Obama when he came in is I think that we were at a global inflection point and a political inflection point, and we didn't use that moment of potential transformation to rewire international institutions. I think he could have done that. America might have become less absolutely powerful, but would have had the power of being the secretariat and helping to bring other powers along. Very important final question. I really appreciate that. Big round of applause for Thomas Greminger, Sergey Karaganov, Nelson Wong, and Clifford Kupchan. Thank you all very, very much for today. Thank you. Greminger, excuse me.